They didn't fire me because I failed. They fired me because I refused to sprint blindly behind a child who mistook noise for strategy. The vice president introduced his nephew as the future of innovation, a 22-year-old whose professional history could barely fill the back of a business card. He strutted into meetings wearing confidence like a tailored suit, throwing buzzwords he barely understood and barking orders at interns who knew more about the system than he ever would. When he looked at me, he didn't see experience. He saw a pace he couldn't control. The VP smiled during the meeting that ended my employment, reciting a pre-written line as if rehearsed in front of a mirror. "Corporate doesn't reward slow thinkers," he declared, as though wisdom was an inconvenience. That sentence wasn't a verdict, it was a confession. They didn't understand the difference between momentum and direction. They believed acceleration solved everything. They never questioned where they were accelerating toward. I didn't defend myself. Adults don't argue with people who treat arrogance as logic. I packed my laptop, shook a few hands from colleagues who avoided eye contact out of fear, and walked out. Yet, as the revolving door closed behind me, a realization settled like dust. I wasn't just another employee. I was the only person who understood the architecture, the redundancy protocols, and the silent safeguards built into the platform slated for launch. They believed speed was an asset. In their world, faster decisions equaled smarter decisions. What they forgot, what no one dared to say aloud, was that precision is the oxygen of stability. Remove it, and everything suffocates. They mistook caution for slowness, prudence for hesitation, and expertise for stubbornness. Arrogance writes the check. Reality cashes it. The launch would prove both. Within 72 hours of my departure, the VP's nephew slid into my chair as though he had earned it. He arrived carrying nothing but confidence and an expensive watch his uncle probably bought. He didn't ask about the architecture behind the launch, didn't request access to the transition files, and didn't once acknowledge the complexity of the systems he now claimed authority over. The young man believed leadership was an accessory, something you wore, not something you understood. Meetings became theater. Instead of discussions grounded in logic and responsibility, he delivered monologues filled with borrowed terminology he barely pronounced. Shortcut culture, he called it, waving his hands as if speed alone built reliability. When someone mentioned testing cycles, he scoffed and instructed the team to trust innovation. He didn't know innovation without verification is a lawsuit waiting to be signed. His ignorance wasn't silent, it was celebrated. The VP hovered behind him like a proud coach admiring a star player who had never trained. Employees nodded, not out of respect, but out of survival. Insecure leaders don't want competence, they want validation. Anyone who questioned the nephew's methods risked proximity to unemployment. It wasn't about ideas anymore. It was about staying invisible enough to avoid blame once things fell apart. He treated deadlines like inspirational quotes and compliance checks like relics from a slower era. He dismissed documented processes as paranoid behavior, erasing safeguards he didn't understand. The system wasn't in his hands. It was dangling from them. The division had once been governed by calculated leadership. Now it was governed by inherited authority, wearing sneakers, and ignorance. I watched quietly from a distance, not with anger, but with the detached curiosity of someone who knows exactly what happens when arrogance replaces skill. The countdown had already begun. The project wasn't a gadget or an app someone rebooted after a glitch. It was a compliance-bound platform with contractual obligations, regulatory checkpoints, and embedded legal exposure. One miscalculation didn't mean inconvenience. It meant litigation, fines, and headlines capable of dismantling reputations overnight. The system was designed like aviation software, not to impress, but to prevent disaster. Every safeguard existed because someone somewhere had once learned a painful lesson. While I worked there, I repeatedly warned leadership that skipping steps in a compliance-driven environment was not innovation. It was negligence, wearing enthusiasm as camouflage. Each time I voiced concern, the VP branded me paranoid, as though caution were a mental flaw rather than a professional asset. Procedures, in their eyes, were shackles slowing progress. The nephew, who wouldn't know the difference between a protocol and a password, called my work legacy behavior. a phrase he repeated so often it became his identity. He removed verification layers I had spent months designing, proudly announcing that he had shaved hours off the launch process. He didn't realize those hours protected millions. He dismantled testing hierarchies, reassigned qualified engineers to presentation design, and replaced oversight meetings with motivational speeches. The room applauded the illusion of momentum, blind to the trap beneath their feet. What fascinated me wasn't their arrogance, it was their confidence in it. They believed speed proved relevance. They treated accuracy as an outdated superstition. In their zeal, they transformed the platform into a time bomb, primed not by malice, but by incompetence. From the outside, I didn't feel anger. I felt inevitability. It's unsettling watching people build their own collapse, brick by brick, while congratulating the architect. The silent clock was ticking, not loudly, but with the steady certainty of consequence. And no one, not the VP, not his prodigy, heard it. 2 weeks before launch, I drafted an email that wasn't emotional, vindictive, or dramatic. It was factual. I outlined, line by line, how the platform's newest version bypassed mandatory compliance verifications, protocols required not by preference, but by federal mandate. I didn't speculate or predict. I stated reality. If deployed in its current state, the system will fail under live load. The sentence was sterile, clinical, and irrefutable. It didn't need adjectives. The truth seldom does. I hesitated before hitting send, not because I feared being wrong, but because I knew they would interpret caution as insubordination. Still, professionalism demanded record. So I clicked. In less than an hour, the VP replied, not with questions or curiosity, but with ego disguised as authority. We don't need lectures from ex-employees. No counterpoint. No request for clarification. Just a dismissal, sharp enough to reveal insecurity behind the punctuation. It was as if acknowledging a flaw would crack the illusion of competence they'd spent weeks performing. Inside that office, any information contradicting the nephew's narrative was treated as an attack. He had convinced leadership that compliance was a relic and validation was optional. The VP, unwilling to appear outdated, embraced ignorance as strategy. They thought my message was an attempt to reclaim relevance. They never considered it could be a lifeline. What they didn't understand, and what time would soon reveal, is that arrogance doesn't refute evidence. It simply postpones the consequences. When I closed my laptop, I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt closure. My job was no longer to protect them from their decisions. My responsibility ended the moment they weaponized dismissal. They believed ignoring me proved power. Instead, it created a timestamp. Their reply wasn't a rebuttal, it was documentation, preserved for the moment accountability finally demanded a witness. Launch day looked like a celebration more than a deployment. Executives floated through the lobby in tailored suits, dazzling investors with rehearsed optimism and buzzwords that sounded like strategy. The VP moved from group to group, proudly displaying the nephew as if he were a technological prodigy rather than an untested apprentice. Photographers were invited. Press statements were prepared. The nephew even gave an interview about redefining corporate velocity, declaring the era of slow processes officially dead. They treated the product like a coronation, not a responsibility. At 9 o'clock, the platform went live. For the first 7 minutes, applause echoed as dashboards flickered online. At minute 12, the celebration stopped. Without warning, the system froze, rebooted, and collapsed again. Engineers stared at screens that now displayed cascading failure logs. Each restart triggered another shutdown, as if the platform were exposing its own wounds, missing checkpoints, disabled verifications, removed redundancies. The safeguards meant to prevent catastrophe had been stripped away in the nephew's pursuit of speed. Phones rang like alarms. Clients who expected seamless execution demanded explanations. Transactions halted mid-process. Data queries jammed regulatory servers. Government compliance officers, already monitoring the launch, requested documentation the team could no longer produce. The VP's smile disappeared faster than the uptime counter. He hovered behind technicians, whispering for quick fixes, still convinced the disaster was temporary. The nephew stepped forward, attempting confidence. He claimed unexpected bugs caused the interruptions. His tone cracked under scrutiny. Developers exchanged looks, not of surprise, but of recognition. These weren't bugs. They were instructions he had proudly deleted, safeguards he deemed unnecessary, and warnings he had ignored. Speed had finally met reality, and reality had no intention of negotiating. Their empire didn't collapse because the system failed. It collapsed because they insisted failure couldn't happen. 3 days after the launch disaster, a mandatory board meeting was convened. The conference room, usually reserved for celebrations and strategic visions, felt more like a tribunal. The chairs were present, yet almost no one sat. Executives paced, murmured, and clutched reports as though weighty paper could shield them from accountability. The same leaders who once mocked caution now rehearsed excuses under their breath. Fear rearranges posture faster than ambition ever does. The VP opened the session with a trembling attempt at narrative control. He blamed legacy employees, claiming outdated procedures and resistance to change had crippled the launch. He spoke as if the nephew's errors were footnotes rather than headlines. But shareholders were not interested in theatrics. They wanted proof. Then legal stood, calm and unsentimental, holding what arrogance always underestimates: records. One by one, they projected the audit trail onto the screen, my emails, my warnings, my protocol outlines, each timestamped with precision. The documentation I created out of responsibility now served as testimony. There was no room for interpretation. Every removed safeguard. The VP now speaks with lowered eyes, reduced from a roaring executive to a cautionary tale executives reference behind closed doors. His nephew, once the poster child of innovation, is no longer employed, not because of scandal, but because even incompetence has an expiration date. Their legacy wasn't ruined by sabotage. It was dismantled by the same shortcuts they mistook for brilliance. I never raised my voice, slammed a door, or demanded recognition. I didn't need theatrics. Competence, unlike ego, does not shout. It waits. And when incompetence inevitably collapses, competence steps over the rubble. Not triumphantly, but inevitably. They gambled on bloodlines over expertise. They didn't lose because I fought back. They lost because consequences don't negotiate. That was my revenge. Without a single outburst,